Today is Wednesday, November 1st, first day of November in Metro Atlanta. I'm Tim Darnell, broadcasting from our First Alert Desk. Welcome to this edition of Political Update. We're joined in the studio by our outstanding producer, Maria Moreau, bringing you all of today's political headlines and those of the past several days, and we have a lot to cover today. First of all, Fulton County Jail has been notorious for a number of reasons. We have documented in depth here at Atlanta News First the horrendous conditions, allegations of abuse and neglect, and the deaths of inmates, 10 that have happened this year so far while they have been in custody of the Fulton County Sheriff's Office. Now, our own investigative reporter, the award-winning, nationally known investigative reporter Andy Parati, launched a series of interviews and packages and videos this week under a special headline called Georgia's Gitmo, how Fulton County Jail has become one of the nation's most notorious local county detention facilities. Why do we call it Georgia's Gitmo? The facility has been compared to the infamous United States military prison in the Guantanamo Bay area of Cuba, where 9/11 suspected terrorists apprehended in other parts of the world by the U.S. military have been housed for months and even years at a time without the benefit of a trial. The reason this is happening is because Guantanamo Bay is not on American soil, so therefore does not fall under the subject of the U.S. Constitution. Not so here in Atlanta, of course. Fulton County Jail has housed more than a dozen individuals, inmates, some on simple misdemeanor charges, for months and even years at a time without ever having their day in court, and subject to some of the most horrendous conditions that have been found in any local county jail throughout the nation. Here is a portion of Andy Parati's report entitled Georgia's Gitmo.
Another shock out of the Fulton County Jail, an inmate stabbed to death.
LaShawn Thompson was found face down in the toilet in his cell, and he was covered in insects.
The 8th victim, Sam Lawrence, who wrote a letter asking for help just 4 days before his death.
His last words was, "Get help, please."
And now the Justice Department is launching an investigation.
It will cost roughly $40 million per year to move roughly 1,000 inmates out of the region and out of the state.
I got a detainee that wants to talk to you all.
I had knives put to my throat, and I had to call my mom telling them, please wire somebody some money or I'm gonna be killed.
Those inmates are not props. They are people. Let's stop playing politics while folks are dying.
Take a look. Here are the faces of the 10 people who died in the county's custody.
Attorneys comparing the jail to Gitmo, the infamous Guantanamo Bay detention camp in Cuba.
You are holding people for long periods of time without charging them with a crime.
No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace.
Until we address those systemic harms that have led to the death of so many in custody, we will continue to see these problems.
That was a portion of award-winning investigative reporter Andy Parati's report entitled Georgia's Gitmo, an extensive series of interviews. For the first time, he interviewed all of Fulton County's top political and law enforcement officials, including Sheriff Pat Labatt, District Attorney Fonnie Willis, Fulton County Commission Chairman Rob Pitts, and Fulton County Superior Court Chief Judge Uriel Glanville. We have all of the full, extensive interviews on Atlanta News First. If you go on our homepage, look under Georgia's Gitmo for this incredibly in-depth look. Also making headlines this week, Northwest Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from the 14th Congressional District. She was campaigning for former President Donald Trump in New Hampshire a couple of days ago and was asked whether or not she would ever consider a run for the White House herself. Her response, "We'll see." She is obviously a strong supporter of President Donald Trump. Former President Trump was the first Georgia elected congressional official to come out and endorse the nation's 45th president when he announced his intention to launch another bid for the White House in 2024. Also, earlier, just within the last few hours, she was the subject of speculation on a podcast hosted by a former top Donald Trump advisor, Steve Bannon, on Steve Bannon's podcast, where she was reported to be on a short list, quote unquote, for Donald Trump's running mate should he actually secure the Republican nomination next year, further putting Georgia on the even further onto the nation's political scene and at the forefront of our national political consciousness. We will continue to follow those developments as well. On Wednesday, today, November 1st, a jury has finally begun the process, I should say, of actually seating a jury in one of the two high-profile organized crime trials happening right here in Atlanta in Fulton County began. Wednesday morning, Chief Superior Court Judge Uriel Glanville, who I mentioned a few moments ago as being part of our extensive series of interviews into the notorious Fulton County Jail and its conditions there, suspended or postponed what was going to be a scheduled hearing on whether or not controversial hip-hop lyrics or rap lyrics can be used in the RICO trial of the rapper known as Young Thug. That hearing was originally set for Wednesday morning. Instead, Judge Glanville postponed that hearing and actually began the process of actually seating a real live jury to hear the massive organized crime trial of rapper Jeffery Williams, also known as Young Thug. This trial is happening at the same time that legal maneuverings are continuing in the RICO trial, the organized crime trial of former President Donald Trump, and now 15 co-defendants who have yet to reach a plea arrangement in that trial. Jury selection, the actual process of selecting a jury, summoning potential jurors for Young Thug's trial, began more than 9 months ago. And this is a selection. The actual process of seating a jury could take several weeks. Don't know if it will happen before the end of the year, but this is one of the two very high-profile RICO organized crime trials that are happening right here in Atlanta. Last week, a U.S. federal court judge upended Georgia's political landscape when he ruled that the congressional and state legislative voting maps that were adopted by lawmakers in 2021 were in violation of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. He has thus ordered the redistricting of all of Georgia's congressional and state house and state senate seats. Lawmakers are going to be convening in less than 5 weeks on Wednesday, November 29th, here in Atlanta at the state capitol, as Governor Brian Kemp has ordered a special legislative session to redraw Georgia's maps in time for the 2024 election. Thousands tens of thousands or even more of Metro Atlantans and other Georgians could find themselves in completely different state house and state senate and and congressional maps, which could also have a major impact on the balance of power between Republicans and Democrats after the 2024 election. And this is going to be the subject of several future political updates, as we're going to bring you the most comprehensive and complete coverage of a redistricting that could reshape the balance of power in the nation's capital. The public just doesn't want every election to feel like this existential choice. That was the finding of a recent survey conducted by Georgia State University Associate Professor of Political Science, Jud Thorton. He did a survey, he and his department recently conducted a survey that shows how differently Americans respond to questions about the state of the nation, about the state of its democratic republic, when asked over the internet as opposed to actually being asked in person. When was the last time you picked up a telephone and heard an automated survey about asking your opinions about the political process? When was the last time someone knocked on your door and asked you about your political leanings or what choice of candidates you were going to support? More and more Americans are responding more negatively, it's been found, to questions about how they feel about the state of the nation if they are asked that question over the internet or if they participate in a digital survey. Again, Professor of Political Science Jud Thorton at Georgia State University recently released a fascinating survey on his findings, and here is our conversation. We are talking with Jud Thorton, who's an associate professor of political science at Georgia State University, really talking about how it seems that with the internet age that people who have opinions about the American political process and our own republic or democracy, however you would like to refer to it, are really having differing opinions on how satisfied they are with the state of the American political scene. And you just recently did a study called Survey Mode and Satisfaction with Democracy. Tell us a little bit about what you found.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So this study looked at the relationship between how a person's interviewed. So traditionally, for a very long time, from the 1940s through 2008, this was done almost exclusively face-to-face for the particular surveys that we were looking at. And starting in 2012, in part because of the cost of doing these sorts of surveys, they added an online component, in which case people would do the interview themselves over the internet. And so there's a long line of research actually dating back, 70, 80 years at this point, to suggest that how people are interviewed influences the sort of answers that they give. And so, there's this idea that democracy is good. I mean, we're taught that in kindergarten, for example, like little kids know this. And so in the presence of an interviewer, if you're asked, how do you feel about democracy? People are going to probably answer maybe a little more positively than they would otherwise. And so then when they're interviewed over the internet, they don't feel that sort of social pressure. So rather than shading up or browning up, they might give a more genuine answer. So starting in 2012, we saw satisfaction decline.
What is the difference between someone being surveyed in person as opposed to over the telephone? Why isn't the internet the internet obviously has the anonymity factor, and you're not talking to someone directly or face to face. But what about telephone surveys?
So telephone surveys work more or less like a face-to-face survey, right? So either talking to somebody on the phone or having somebody knock on your door. There's that social connection, and we sort of feel that, we don't want even an interviewer to think negatively of us, even if we're never going to interact with them ever again. So the same is true face-to-face or over the phone.
Now, one of the kind of summaries I saw in the news release, the public just doesn't want every election to feel like this existential choice. Elaborate a little bit on that for me.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So to put that in the context of what we found is political scientists have been, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, have been tracking this sort of retreat in positivity towards democracy. And so that is genuine, right? So part of the decline from 2008 to 2012 and 16 was because an increased number of people were being interviewed over the or by the internet, over the internet. But nevertheless, even taking that into account, there really is a decline in satisfaction. And I'm not sure that means people want to abandon democracy, but they feel tired of the choices that they're being presented. So, if you're presented with a very conservative candidate and then a very liberal candidate, most people sort of throw their hands up and say, well, given these options, I can make a choice. But it's very different than, say, deciding between Bill Clinton and Bob Dole in 1996.
Is this necessarily good for the state of the American Republic?
Well, on the one hand, turnout's way up, right? I mean, people are voting as a response to the choices that they're being offered. But I think, so that's positive. On the other hand, I think what we saw after 2020 is if some politicians want to take advantage of the increased partisan rancor, they can, right? And so that's bad, right? I mean, I don't think people would storm the Capitol, 40 years ago when the choices, it's like, oh, my side didn't win and I'm upset, but the stakes didn't seem so high.
But this trend is worldwide, isn't it? Is that what your research has found?
So our research doesn't touch on that, but yes, this is a worldwide trend that you've seen this. But again, I think in all cases, there's enough evidence to suggest it's not the public that's driving this, right? That I mean, even if the public is a little bit less satisfied, or they have some misgivings about political processes, it takes encouragement, I guess, is sort of the euphemism that I would use, from politicians to sort of go to a darker place with it.
Do you believe that the future of the American democratic form of government is endangered from this increasingly partisan rhetoric that seems targeted to drive people from one end of the ideological perspective to another?
Think about how I want to answer this one. So you asked if I think it's at risk. I think the actual risk of us, the United States, I think the risk of the United States becoming something other than a democracy is not especially high, but it's higher than it's ever been, right? And so it's one of those things that, I don't want to be Chicken Little about this, that say, the sky is falling, but I wouldn't want to put my head in the sand either, right? I mean, there is a real risk that is something we need to continue to monitor. But on the other hand, I could also be optimistic about this. If I think about what happened here in Georgia, a sizable number of Democrats voted in the Republican primary, it seems, for candidates that they thought would protect democracy. And they were doing that knowing that those candidates would be stronger general election candidates, which would harm the Democratic Party, but nevertheless, they were putting that sort of principle over partisanship. And then even in the general election, you still saw, I mean, it's not a large number of people, but there's a non-trivial number of people that were voting for both Kemp and Walker, right? Or Warnock, I should say. I'm sorry, Kemp and Warnock. So yeah, I think it's something we need to keep an eye on, but I wouldn't lose sleep over it yet.
What do you think the future holds in terms of the internet's influence on political perceptions and opinions? The genie's out of the bottle. The internet's not going away. More and more people are accessing all manner of news and data and opinions via the World Wide Web. What's the future impact of technology on the American political process?
So two things. I mean, so to the narrow finding that we examined, when we're comparing interviews done over the internet to prior years, it means we need to be cautious, right? Because answers are going to be different. In terms of the internet's influence on attitudes, if people find themselves using social media to the point that they're only being exposed to like-minded ideas, that does pose a risk that people will become more extreme themselves, although the evidence for that isn't quite as strong as you might think, right? I mean, it does exist, but it's not clear that it's not clear exactly what's driving it, which is sort of an unsatisfying answer. But it's certainly something that could happen and probably does happen to an extent, but I don't think that's what's driving what we're seeing in the public.
Well, those are issues we will continue to monitor here at Atlanta News First. Thanks to Jud Thorton, Associate Professor of Political Science at Georgia State University, talking about survey methods and how they may contribute to differing opinions of the American political process. Thanks to all of you for watching and listening to this edition of Political Update on Atlanta News First and AtlantaNewsFirst.com.